fresh herbs, okay? So this batch here is herbs that I put in a jar of water with a bag over it in the fridge. These also went into the fridge. I took the herbs and I put a wet paper towel and bundled it around there and then put it in the plastic bag, and these were in the fridge. This was also in the fridge, but I did not cover them with a plastic bag. So, and there's water in the bottom. So I put the water and, but just left them in the fridge without anything covering them. And you can already tell they don't look too good. Then we have, excuse my shirt by the way, this is my painting outfit. Then we have herbs that, like, you know, I just basically left them in the bag as I got them from the store. No water, but they were covered in the bag, and I just threw them in the fridge. The other thing we've got here, let me go behind, is we have these guys. So sometimes herbs come in like these little plastic packets, and then I just left some of them inside the packet. And then the last thing I did was I took some herbs here and I put water in a bowl and covered it, just like the ones in the fridge, except I didn't put them in the fridge. I left them in the counter, on top of my counter at home. And then this is a basil that I left on my counter in a jar of water as well. Okay, so let's just talk about what works best for which herbs. Let's go ahead and take off everything. All right, so let's talk about what works best so that you just get that straight away. So by far, for pretty much most of the herbs here, what works best is to either store your herbs in a glass jar like this with water with a plastic bag over it in the fridge, or this worked out really well too. If you can see these, like this is Italian parsley. It looks super fresh. Honestly, the mint here looks really good. The rosemary, it looks like I just picked it practically. The thyme, it's all looking really good. So in this case, it's just wrapped in a very wet paper towel, just around the ends. You can see here, I just, wet a paper towel, wrapped it up, and then put it in the plastic bag. And what you want to do is when you get the herbs, you want to snip off the ends. So that's what I did with all of these. I snipped off the ends of the herbs so it was like a fresh cut, and immediately stuck them in water. I did not wash these herbs beforehand. If you do wash them, they get all wet, and then they're gonna start going bad. So it's best to only wash the herbs once you're actually ready to use them. So that was the best way to store it. Snip off the ends, one, don't wash them, and stick them either in a jar with water, covered with plastic, in the fridge, or wet paper towel, wrapped up inside a Ziploc bag in the fridge. Honestly, as far as saving space, as you can see, I mean, this looks kind of cool, but it honestly took up a lot of space in my fridge having these little canning jars. So, I mean, if you just had 1 or 2 fresh herbs you were using, this would be fine. But if you had like 5 or 6 herbs, it gets to be, taking over your fridge, and now you have no room for your chicken. So this definitely seems like the best way to go as far as space saving. And you can see, I hope you can see, the herbs are really, the cilantro looks great, the mint looks great, the thyme, the rosemary. The dill is starting to look a little sad, but I forgot, I wanted to share with you guys the timing of this. I did this project December 13th. It was a Wednesday evening. It's now January 1st, so this has been over 2.5 weeks, you guys. I meant to do it sooner, but it just shows you just how on top of things I am. And this is honestly how you guys might be too. So it's actually good to show in reality what happens, when you don't do it the ideal way. So this is longer than I had meant to let it go. And definitely, especially like this dill is starting to look pretty sad. The chives are super sad. You wouldn't be able to use those at this point. But definitely I would say for at least in a week and a half, even the chives and dill were looking pretty good. And all of these other herbs, the green onions, they're also not happy anymore. But honestly, all the other herbs stored this way, they look perfectly usable still after over 2.5 weeks. And the other thing is, it's suggested that you change the water or put a fresh towel. I didn't do that, you guys. Once again, I have an 8-year-old and a husband and a busy work life. I don't feel well a lot because I have a chronic illness, so that's just not something that I'm gonna bother doing. So this water hasn't been changed. That would have been ideal, and yet you can see just how great these all still look. They're still crisp, and they're not all wilty. So that these two ways are the best way to store your herbs for that. You can see with what I stored in the fridge without being covered, that's a huge key to keeping it fresh and crisp, because this had water and it was in the fridge, but well, this was basil. What's left of it looks pretty sad. And you know, the cilantro, it is still usable, but it feels physically like it's wilty compared to the stuff that was covered with plastic. What you're doing is when you cover it with plastic, you're keeping the moisture in so that the moisture doesn't escape, you know, into the air of the fridge. So these have all stayed really great. The experiment with keeping the herbs on the counter, from what I've heard, this is affected by the humidity in the area where you live. Now, I live in a very dry area, and again, these two here were covered. Now, this you can't even tell what it is anymore. This was actually rosemary and thyme, and it's completely molded. There's water in the bottom of this dish, but I didn't change it, and it just sat out on my counter with this bag over it, and it molded. So that didn't work out too well. This was some sage, some thyme, and some basil, and it had a bag over it. And this actually did look really good for, I would say, at least the first week and a half. So now it's obviously not usable, except actually actually this is oregano. The oregano is still looking pretty good, but with the bag over it, this is how you want to store that with the bag over it. This looked really nice for a good week and a half, and I would have to say, pretty much just for the basil, it was recommended that you don't store basil in the fridge. So all these other herbs seemed to do well in the fridge when done the proper way, but they suggested with basil, it just doesn't do well in the fridge and it starts turning black really quickly. And it is true that by leaving the basil in water in a jar, covered on the counter, you know, in your kitchen, it did last a good week and a half before it fell apart. Now this is kind of funny, you guys. This one I left out on the counter. This is basil in a jar with water, not covered. And I live in a very dry area. The humidity is probably like 30% most of the time. It immediately wilted, like in a day, and looked super sad, totally not usable. So my son comes along and he sees like me doing this experiment. He's like, I wonder what would happen if you put a plastic bag on it now, like now that it's all wilted. I'm like, I don't know, why don't you find out, you know, trying to encourage my son to experiment and be scientific. So he put this plastic bag over the totally wilted basil, and lo and behold, the next day it had revived like this. And I was really surprised. Now the funny thing is about this, after he did that, I took the bag back off because I was like, well, I still need my experiment to like take place in the right way. So I took the bag back off, but the funny thing is it didn't wilt again after that. After I did that, it stayed fresh like this, and even though there's a couple like dead leaves now that are like dried out, the ones that are still green, honestly, they're still usable, you know, like 2.5 weeks later. So I thought that was pretty crazy. So there's that. Now I did notice for herbs that you can tell they're just more of a dry type herb, like thyme, rosemary. You know, you can tell even when you grow them or just looking at them that they're not as delicate as things like mint and cilantro. You can tell that cilantro and mint are very just thin and more of a watery herb. And then these types of herbs are very dry, right? They're hardier, more woody. And I did notice that even in the little packages that they come in, these little dry plastic packages, they actually held up pretty well. So like for instance, here's the thyme just left in the package for 2.5 weeks. If you compare it with the one I did here in the wet paper towel in the Ziploc bag, I mean, this one definitely looks much fresher. But this one, honestly, I mean, it doesn't look that bad. Probably though, taste-wise, this is gonna be a lot better. I mean, you can tell it just looks like everything's been preserved, but not too bad really. Whereas like if you look at something like the chives, you can see they're totally yellowed and not usable anymore. Same thing with the rosemary. This was like a living rosemary it's actually all molded. It's all moldy. And then if you look at this rosemary with the paper towel wrapped and then in the Ziploc bag in the fridge, these were both in the fridge. I mean, this looks like I just picked it. And then this one's moldy. Let's take a look. So what happens to basil when you just leave it in the bag you bought it in? This is kind of one of those things where I wish I had gloves. I'm gonna open the bag, and this, I'm not gonna touch it. This is what it looks like. It's completely like black and wet and like molding. So pretty nasty. And then, you know, compare with this that's been on my counter. Again, if you have that plastic bag over it, it's gonna keep it fresh. So I bought this the same night. This is the same batch of basil. Look at this one and look at that one. Big difference, right? So don't leave your basil in a bag in the fridge. Don't do that with your basil. Here is an example of Italian parsley. So again, same night. This is 2.5 weeks old. And then here's Italian parsley that I stored in the fridge, covered in a jar of water. And then here's the Italian parsley with the wet paper towel on it. These look fantastic. They look like I just picked them. And then this one is all totally yellowed and I would not use this in a dish. So again, pretty big difference there. I have to say, when it comes to spearmint, it's pretty hardy. This was left in the bag. Honestly, it looks almost as good as the ones that I stored in the water, like the wet paper towel or the little jar here. It actually looks almost as fresh, honestly. So that's kind of surprising. So it looks like the mint can handle a lot more than other herbs. This basil is basil that I just basically put a dry paper towel around. Pretty much from what I've discovered, it's basil that is more sensitive to being like moist. So all these other herbs seem to do well with being moist, and that's why we keep that moisture in, and they do well. But the basil just starts turning black. So this one I put in a dry paper towel and then in a bag in the fridge. And I mean, again, it's not usable now after 2.5 weeks, but it did definitely last quite a bit longer like this than just left, you know, in that bag without a paper towel. This got all black and wet and nasty. So, so with that, at least try to keep the basil more dry. I hope that helps you guys. So again, the best way to store pretty much all your fresh herbs, except for basil, is going to be you snip off the ends and then you store them with moisture on the ends, which is either going to be in a jar of water or in a very wet paper towel wrapped. And then you want to keep the moisture in by putting a plastic bag over the tops of your herbs or keeping them in a Ziploc bag. That way it keeps the moisture in. And that's going to make all your fresh herbs except for basil last the longest and look the freshest. And with basil, you're going to want to keep it out on your counter with water in a jar and keep a plastic bag over it to keep the moisture in. And that won't last as long as these other fresh herbs long term, but I still would say that this basil that I had like that, it was a good 1.5 weeks that it still looked pretty good, which is a pretty long time. And then these others, it's been over 2.5 weeks. So that's good. If you want more details, I'm gonna have this all written out in the blog post that goes with this, so that'll help you guys. All right? Okay. And my son wants to come say hello real quick. Do you want to tell everybody how old you are now?
I am 8, as you said earlier in the video. Kind of bent down.
Yeah, we're way down here. Anyway.
I can especially tell this one is very rotten.
Yes, we can't wait to throw that away. My husband was like, so what are we doing with that? I'm like, it's part of an experiment. Don't throw it away. All right, we'll talk to you guys later. Bye.